The entire cafeteria went silent before anyone realized that a single moment was about to change the future of one of the most powerful families in town. My name is Ava Collins, and until that Friday afternoon, I believed some people lived by different rules than everyone else. At 17, I had spent most of my life watching students step aside whenever Brianna Hayes walked into a room. She was wealthy, popular, and completely aware of the influence her family carried. Her father, Mayor Jonathan Hayes, had been the most recognizable face in our community for years. His picture hung in public buildings. His name appeared in local newspapers almost every week. People spoke carefully when discussing the Hayes family. Teachers treated Brianna with unusual patience. Students laughed at her jokes even when they were not funny. Nobody wanted to become her next target. Lunch period had started like any normal day. The cafeteria buzzed with conversation. Trays slid across tables. Friends shared stories about weekend plans. Sunlight streamed through the large windows overlooking the athletic field. I was sitting with two classmates discussing an upcoming history project when I noticed Brianna approaching. The change in the room was immediate. Conversations softened. Several students looked up from their meals. Others exchanged nervous glances. Brianna enjoyed attention, and everyone knew it. She stopped beside our table with three friends standing behind her. At first, she made a few sarcastic comments about my presentation from earlier that week. I ignored them. That usually worked. But she kept going. She criticized my clothes. She mocked the fact that I spent more time studying than attending parties. Her friends laughed on cue. Several nearby students looked uncomfortable. I remember feeling embarrassed, but more than that, I felt confused. We were not enemies. We barely spoke to each other. I could not understand why she seemed determined to turn an ordinary lunch into a public performance. Finally, I looked up and calmly asked her to leave us alone. The smile disappeared from her face. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. The entire cafeteria seemed to be holding its breath. Then everything changed. Gasps echoed through the room. A student dropped a drink near the back wall. Someone whispered Brianna's name. Another student pulled out a phone. Dozens of eyes focused on our table. Yet what surprised me most was not what happened. It was Brianna's reaction afterward. She looked around confidently, almost proudly, as if she expected everyone to approve of her behavior. In that moment, I realized she truly believed consequences were for other people. Why would she think otherwise? Her family had influence. Her father controlled connections that reached into nearly every corner of town. For years, people had looked away whenever the Hayes family crossed a line. I slowly picked up my phone from beside my tray and looked around the room. Students stared back at me. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked afraid. Nobody seemed willing to speak. Brianna smirked and turned away with her friends as if the situation were already finished. She believed the story ended there. She had no idea that several students had recorded everything. She had no idea that the video would spread far beyond the school. And she definitely had no idea that when I walked through my front door later that afternoon and showed my mother what had happened, she would look at the screen, fall completely silent, and say 7 words that would change everything. I hoped I would never make this call. The drive home that afternoon felt longer than usual. Every traffic light seemed to last forever, and the silence inside our house felt even heavier once I arrived. My mother, Rebecca Collins, was already home from work. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold hours earlier. When I showed her the video, she watched it twice without saying a word. That alone worried me. My mother was not the type of person who remained silent when something bothered her. She always had an opinion. She always knew what to say. But this time, she simply stared at the screen. Then she whispered those 7 words that immediately caught my attention. I hoped I would never make this call. I sat across from her, trying to understand what she meant. "What call?" I asked. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she closed the laptop and folded her hands together. Her expression had changed completely. The woman sitting in front of me no longer looked like a concerned parent reacting to a school incident. She looked like someone who had just opened a door she had spent years trying to keep closed. "Ava," she said carefully, "there are things about Jonathan Hayes that most people in this town do not know." Hearing the mayor's name spoken that way felt strange. In our community, people usually talked about him with respect, admiration, or caution. My mother sounded different. She sounded disappointed. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Outside, Evening sunlight stretched across the backyard. A sprinkler clicked rhythmically somewhere down the street. Ordinary sounds filled the silence while my mind raced with questions. Finally, my mother stood and walked toward a cabinet near the living room. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a thick folder that looked old enough to have been sitting there for years. The edges were worn. Several papers stuck out from the sides. She placed it gently on the table between us. "What is that?" I asked. "Something I promised myself I would never need again," she replied. My heart began to beat faster. She opened the folder and revealed newspaper clippings, photographs, meeting notes, and printed emails. Most of them were years old. Some were more than a decade old. I quickly realized these were not random documents. They all involved city projects, public meetings, and one familiar name that appeared over and over again. "Jonathan Hayes. Why do you have all this?" I asked. Rebecca took a deep breath. "Because a long time ago, before he became mayor, I worked with people who tried to expose several serious concerns involving city contracts and public funds." The room suddenly felt smaller. Everything I thought I knew about our town seemed less certain. My mother pointed toward one particular document and shook her head. Nobody wanted to listen back then. She paused before looking directly into my eyes. "But things are different now." I glanced down at the video still visible on my phone screen. The cafeteria incident suddenly seemed much larger than a school conflict. My mother reached for her cell phone and scrolled through her contacts. Her hand remained steady, but I could see determination in her eyes. She stopped on a single name and pressed call. As the phone rang, she looked at me and quietly said, "The person who answers this call has spent years waiting for proof that people are finally ready to talk." Then someone picked up on the other end, and everything began to change. The man who answered the phone was Daniel Mercer. Even I recognized the name. For years, he had been one of the most respected investigative journalists in our state. He was known for uncovering stories that other reporters ignored and asking questions that powerful people preferred not to answer. My mother switched the call to speaker after introducing herself. Daniel listened without interrupting as she briefly explained why she was calling. When she mentioned Jonathan Hayes, the silence on the other end became noticeable. Finally, Daniel spoke. His voice was calm but serious. "I have not heard that name connected to those files in a very long time." My mother glanced at me before opening the folder again. "I kept everything," she said. "Every document, every note, every email." Daniel did not sound surprised. Instead, he sounded relieved. "Then perhaps some questions can finally be answered." The call lasted nearly 40 minutes. Most of the conversation focused on events that happened years before I was born. Community projects, public funding, promises made to residents, contracts awarded under unusual circumstances. None of it sounded dramatic on the surface, but together the pieces formed a picture that was difficult to ignore. More importantly, Daniel seemed to already know part of the story. It was clear he had investigated similar concerns before, but never obtained enough evidence to move forward. Now, for the first time, someone was offering documents that filled gaps he had spent years trying to understand. After the call ended, my mother sat quietly for several seconds. "Will he publish something?" I asked. Rebecca shook her head. "Not immediately. Daniel is careful. He verifies everything." That answer made sense. Real investigations did not happen overnight. Still, I could tell something important had already changed. The next morning at school, the cafeteria video was everywhere. Students watched it between classes. Parents discussed it online. Local community groups shared it across social media platforms. What surprised me most was how many people privately reached out. Some students admitted they had experienced similar treatment from Brianna in the past. Others confessed they had stayed silent because they believed nobody would support them. The story was growing larger with every passing hour. Meanwhile, Brianna acted as if nothing had happened. She walked through the hallways surrounded by friends, smiling confidently and ignoring the whispers around her. She seemed completely convinced that the situation would disappear within a few days. In many ways, I understood why she felt that way. For years, problems connected to the Hayes family seemed to fade before they caused real consequences. But this time felt different. That afternoon, Daniel Mercer arrived at our house carrying a notebook and a small recorder. He spent nearly 3 hours reviewing documents with my mother. Occasionally, his expression changed as he examined certain records. Once, he even leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for several seconds without speaking. When the meeting finally ended, He carefully organized copies of the documents into a folder. Then he stood near the front door and looked directly at my mother. "If these records are authentic," he said, "this is much bigger than anyone realizes." As he walked toward his car, my phone buzzed with a breaking news notification. A local reporter was asking new questions about Jonathan Hayes. And for the first time, those questions were being taken seriously. Over the next several days, the atmosphere throughout town began to change in ways that were impossible to ignore. What started as a conversation about a school incident slowly evolved into something much larger. Daniel Mercer worked carefully, verifying every document before publishing a single word. He contacted former city employees, reviewed archived records, and compared years of public statements with information contained inside the files my mother had preserved. Meanwhile, life at school became increasingly uncomfortable for Brianna Hayes. Students who once competed for her attention now watched from a distance. The whispers in hallways grew louder. Social media discussions spread beyond our town. For the first time in her life, Brianna seemed unable to control the narrative surrounding her. Yet she continued acting as though everything would eventually disappear. One Thursday morning, Daniel published the first article. The headline itself was enough to send shockwaves through the community. The story did not make accusations. It simply presented verified facts, timelines, and questions regarding several old city projects connected to Jonathan Hayes. Within hours, the article became the most discussed topic in town. Residents shared it across social media platforms. Local radio hosts debated its significance. Community leaders issued statements calling for transparency. By lunchtime, everyone seemed to be talking about the same thing. At school, teachers attempted to keep students focused on classwork, but even they appeared distracted. During study hall, I noticed several students reading Daniel's article on their laptops. The expressions on their faces ranged from curiosity to disbelief. What surprised people most was not the information itself. It was the supporting documentation. Every claim included records, dates, and sources. Daniel had done exactly what my mother predicted he would do. He verified everything. That evening, local television stations began covering the story. Reporters stood outside City Hall discussing questions raised by the investigation. Public officials were asked for comments. Some declined. Others provided carefully worded responses. Jonathan Hayes appeared briefly before cameras and insisted he welcomed transparency. His voice remained calm, but even through the television screen, I sensed tension beneath the surface. The next day brought an even bigger surprise. Several former city employees agreed to speak with reporters. None of them made dramatic accusations. Instead, they described situations that sounded strangely familiar when compared to the documents my mother had saved. Small details, unanswered questions, decisions that never seemed fully explained. Each individual story might have been dismissed on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. By the weekend, the conversation had expanded far beyond our community. Larger media outlets began referencing Daniel's work. Journalists from neighboring cities requested interviews. The pressure surrounding City Hall increased with every passing hour. Then, late Saturday afternoon, Daniel called my mother. I listened from across the room as she answered. His tone sounded more serious than ever before. After several minutes, she slowly sat down at the kitchen table. When the call ended, I immediately knew something significant had happened. "What is it?" I asked. Rebecca looked directly at me. "Daniel found additional records." She paused before continuing. "Records nobody knew existed." A chill ran through me. The story was no longer growing. It was accelerating. And somewhere inside City Hall, people were beginning to realize that the questions they once ignored were about to become impossible to avoid. By Monday morning, the town felt different. It was not because of a single headline or a single article. It was because people had started asking questions they had avoided for years. Everywhere I went, conversations stopped when someone mentioned City Hall. Coffee shops buzzed with debate. Community forums filled with comments. Even neighbors who rarely discussed politics suddenly had strong opinions. Daniel Mercer's latest report had done more than attract attention. It had encouraged people to look closer. The newly discovered records became the center of every discussion. According to Daniel's reporting, several documents showed inconsistencies between public statements and internal records connected to old city development projects. Nothing in the reports was exaggerated. That was what made them so powerful. The facts spoke for themselves. Dates matched. Records aligned. Witnesses confirmed details independently. The story was becoming harder to dismiss with every new publication. At school, the atmosphere continued to shift. Students who once admired Brianna Hayes now seemed uncertain about her. Some avoided conversations altogether. Others openly questioned why so many people had spent years treating her family differently. Brianna still walked through the hallways with confidence, but it no longer looked natural. It looked forced. For the first time, she appeared aware that people were watching her for reasons she could not control. Meanwhile, inside City Hall, pressure continued building. Local reporters requested interviews. Community organizations demanded transparency. Several council members publicly called for an independent review of the records Daniel had uncovered. Jonathan Hayes maintained a calm public image, but every appearance seemed more strained than the last. His answers became shorter. His smile seemed rehearsed. The certainty that once defined him was beginning to crack. One evening, Daniel released another article. The reaction was immediate. State-level media outlets picked up the story. After ending the call, she looked toward the kitchen window for several seconds. "The truth has momentum now," she said quietly. "And momentum is difficult to stop." As I walked through the school parking lot that afternoon, my phone vibrated with a breaking news alert. The date for the public review had just been scheduled, and for the first time, it seemed possible that answers were finally coming. The morning of the public review arrived beneath dark clouds and an unusual sense of anticipation that seemed to cover the entire town. Long before the session was scheduled to begin, reporters had already gathered outside the municipal building. News vans lined nearby streets. Camera crews adjusted equipment. Residents formed small groups on sidewalks discussing theories and possibilities. Some believed the review would change nothing. Others believed it would become a turning point in local history. By the time I arrived at school, everyone was talking about the same thing. Students checked news updates between classes. Teachers tried to keep lessons moving forward, but attention drifted toward the developing story. It felt as though the entire community was holding its breath. Throughout the morning, updates appeared online almost continuously. Journalists reported that attendance inside the review chamber had reached capacity. Additional seating areas had been opened for residents. Officials from neighboring communities were reportedly observing the proceedings. Even people who rarely followed local government seemed invested in the outcome. Around noon, the first detailed reports began to emerge. Documents previously discussed in Daniel Mercer's articles were formally presented for examination. Timelines were reviewed. Records were compared. Witness statements were summarized. The process moved slowly, but each new update reinforced a simple reality. Questions that had once been dismissed were now receiving public attention. That alone represented a significant change. Meanwhile, inside City Hall, the atmosphere reportedly grew increasingly tense. Advisors entered and exited private offices throughout the day. Meetings occurred behind closed doors. Public statements became less frequent. Several local reporters commented that officials appeared unusually cautious. For years, Jonathan Hayes had projected confidence during every challenge. Now that confidence seemed more difficult to maintain. Late that afternoon, Daniel released a brief update through his publication. He confirmed that additional records recently discovered had been accepted for review and would receive further examination. The announcement immediately generated another wave of discussion online. Community members shared reactions. Local organizations issued statements supporting transparency. Momentum continued building. At school, even Brianna appeared affected by the growing pressure surrounding her family. During the final period of the day, I saw her sitting quietly near a classroom window. She was alone. Her phone rested face down on the desk. For the first time since everything began, she looked less like the untouchable daughter of a powerful mayor and more like a teenager struggling to understand events beyond her control. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen. Mostly, I felt surprised by how quickly certainty could disappear. That evening, my mother and I followed live coverage from our living room. Analysts discussed testimony. Reporters summarized developments. Community leaders called for patience while the process continued. Then, shortly before the broadcast ended, a new announcement appeared across the screen. Additional hearings would be scheduled. Investigators planned to review further materials connected to earlier findings. The story was far from over. In fact, it appeared to be expanding. My mother looked toward the television and slowly shook her head. "Once people stop being afraid to speak," she said quietly, "the truth has a way of finding its own path." A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with another notification. According to multiple sources, several longtime associates of Jonathan Hayes had agreed to cooperate with reviewers. And suddenly, for the first time since this story began, it seemed possible that the strongest walls protecting City Hall were beginning to crack. The days following the review felt like the calm before a storm. Outwardly, life continued as usual. Students attended classes. Businesses opened their doors. Traffic moved through downtown streets. Yet beneath that familiar routine, everyone knew something significant was approaching. The additional hearings announced during the review had changed everything. People were no longer asking whether questions existed. They were asking what answers would be revealed next. By the beginning of the following week, attendance at public meetings had reached record levels. Residents who had never spoken during community discussions suddenly stepped forward to share concerns and experiences. Local newspapers devoted entire sections to updates. Television crews remained stationed outside City Hall. The story had become impossible to ignore. Daniel Mercer continued publishing carefully documented reports. Each article added context rather than sensationalism. He presented timelines, records, and interviews that allowed readers to draw their own conclusions. That approach earned him growing credibility. Even people who disagreed with him admitted his reporting was thorough. Meanwhile, inside City Hall, the atmosphere reportedly became increasingly strained. Several longtime associates of Jonathan Hayes publicly announced they would cooperate fully with reviewers. Their statements were respectful but revealing. Many described a culture where difficult questions were often delayed rather than addressed. None of these comments created immediate conclusions, but together they painted a picture that concerned many residents. One afternoon, a particularly important hearing took place. Community members filled every available seat. Additional rooms were opened to accommodate the crowd. Reporters lined the walls taking notes. Witnesses spoke about past projects and administrative decisions. Some testimony focused on missing opportunities. Other testimony focused on communication failures. Piece by piece, reviewers assembled a clearer understanding of events that had remained clouded for years. At school, the effects were becoming more visible. Brianna Hayes no longer seemed interested in maintaining the image she once projected. She attended classes quietly and avoided unnecessary attention. During lunch, she often sat alone reading messages on her phone. The contrast between her current behavior and the confidence she displayed only weeks earlier was impossible to miss. I occasionally caught her looking toward groups of students who once surrounded her. Most had moved on. Popularity built on influence had proven fragile. One evening, my mother received another call from Daniel. He sounded cautiously optimistic. Several news sources had provided information that confirmed details from earlier records. Independent verification strengthened the credibility of the entire investigation. When the call ended, Rebecca sat silently for a moment before speaking. "People are finally telling the truth because they believe someone will listen." Her words stayed with me. The next morning, breaking news spread across every major platform covering the story. Reviewers announced that preliminary findings would soon be released publicly. Analysts immediately began discussing possible outcomes. Community leaders urged patience. Residents refreshed news pages throughout the day. Anticipation reached levels I had never seen before. As evening approached, another development emerged. A major press conference had been scheduled for later that week. No details were provided about what would be announced. Yet the reaction was immediate. Reporters rushed to prepare coverage. Social media exploded with speculation. And somewhere behind the closed doors of City Hall, people who once felt completely secure were suddenly facing a future filled with uncertainty. The press conference drew more attention than any public event our town had seen in years. By the time it began, television stations from across the state had arrived. Reporters filled every available seat. Residents gathered outside watching large screens set up by local news organizations. Even students at school followed updates on their phones whenever teachers allowed it. The sense of anticipation was overwhelming. Everyone knew an announcement was coming. Nobody knew exactly what form it would take. When the broadcast started, the room fell quiet. Officials presented a summary of preliminary findings from the review process. Their language remained measured and professional, but the conclusions were impossible to ignore. Questions raised by Daniel Mercer's reporting had been validated by additional records and testimony. Several administrative decisions would continue receiving examination. Recommendations for reforms were already being discussed. The story had moved beyond speculation. It had become part of the public record. Then came the moment that changed everything. A statement from Jonathan Hayes was read before the cameras. As the words appeared on television screens throughout town, a wave of disbelief spread through the audience. After years of leading the community, Jonathan Hayes announced that he would step down from office. The decision, according to the statement, was made in the interest of allowing the town to move forward while ongoing reviews continued. For several seconds, reporters seemed stunned. Then questions erupted from every direction. News alerts appeared instantly. Social media platforms exploded with reactions. My phone vibrated nonstop with messages from classmates. Some could hardly believe what they were reading. Others said they had expected it for weeks. Across town, people gathered in restaurants, living rooms, and public spaces discussing the announcement. The political landscape of the community had changed in a single afternoon. At school the next day, the atmosphere felt completely different. Conversations that once centered on rumors now focused on reality. Jonathan Hayes was no longer mayor. The position that had seemed permanent was suddenly vacant. As for Brianna, she arrived quietly and kept to herself. There were no dramatic scenes, no confrontations, just a noticeable absence of the confidence that once followed her everywhere. For the first time, she could not rely on her family name to shape how others viewed her. That evening, Daniel Mercer released a final article summarizing the sequence of events that led to the resignation. The article did not celebrate anyone's downfall. Instead, it focused on accountability, transparency, and the importance of public trust. Reading it, I realized something important. This story had never truly been about power. It had been about responsibility. My mother sat beside me as I finished the article. She looked thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Do you regret making the call?" I asked. Rebecca shook her head. "No," she answered quietly. "But I never wanted any of this to happen." She paused before continuing. "I only wanted the truth to have a chance." Outside our window, the town looked peaceful. Streetlights illuminated familiar roads. Cars moved through the evening as they always had. Yet everything felt different. An era had ended. The influence that once seemed untouchable was gone. And although many questions still remained, one thing had become clear. The future of our community would no longer be shaped by silence. 6 months later, the story that once dominated every conversation in town had faded from the headlines, but its impact remained visible everywhere. Community meetings were more transparent. Public records were easier to access. Residents who had once felt ignored now participated actively in local discussions. The changes did not happen overnight, but they happened. For the first time in many years, people believed their voices mattered. As for me, life had gradually returned to something that felt normal. Senior year was coming to an end. College acceptance letters covered part of my bedroom desk. Between classes, graduation planning, and preparing for the future, I spent less time thinking about everything that had happened. Yet every now and then, I would walk through the cafeteria and remember the afternoon that unexpectedly changed so many lives. The biggest surprise came a few weeks before graduation. I was leaving the library after finishing a scholarship application when I heard someone call my name. When I turned around, I saw Brianna Hayes standing near the entrance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked different, not because of her appearance, but because of the way she carried herself. The confidence that once demanded attention had been replaced by something quieter, something more genuine. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I owe you an apology," she said. There was no audience, no cameras, no friends standing nearby, just the two of us. Brianna admitted she had spent years believing her family name would protect her from consequences. She admitted she often treated people differently because she assumed status mattered more than character. Most importantly, she accepted responsibility without making excuses. I listened carefully. Months earlier, I might have imagined that moment very differently. But standing there, I realized I was no longer carrying anger. Too much had happened. Too much had changed. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. Brianna nodded. There were tears in her eyes, but she smiled slightly. "I am trying to become a better person," she said. "That is all I can do now." We wished each other well and walked in opposite directions. It was a simple conversation, Yet it felt like the final chapter of a story that had begun many months earlier. Graduation day arrived beneath a bright blue sky. Families filled the stadium seats. Students laughed, took photographs, and celebrated the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. As I waited for my name to be called, I looked into the crowd and saw my mother smiling proudly. Rebecca Collins had never wanted attention. She never wanted headlines. She only wanted the truth to matter. In that moment, I understood how much courage that required. When my name was announced, I walked across the stage and accepted my diploma. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. The future stretched out before me, filled with possibilities. Looking back, the lesson was never about politics, popularity, or power. It was about choices. One person chose arrogance. Another chose silence for many years. Another chose to speak up. And eventually, everyone faced the results of those choices. Jonathan Hayes lost the position he spent years building. Brianna learned that respect cannot be inherited. My mother discovered that the truth is worth defending. And I learned that staying calm in the face of unfairness can be more powerful than anger. As graduation caps soared into the air and sunlight filled the stadium, I realized something I would never forget. Power may influence people for a season, but integrity influences them for a lifetime. And in the end, truth did not destroy our town. It helped it become better.